For 9 seasons, Jeremy Wade took us into the darkest corners of the world's rivers, hunting creatures that seemed pulled straight from nightmares.
He stood waist-deep in water the color of strong tea, holding a fish that shouldn't have existed anymore, and he was smiling for the camera like it was the greatest day of his life. It wasn't. It was the day he decided he could never do this again. For 11 seasons, Daniel Voss told the world he was hunting monsters. He wasn't. He was hunting the last of something, over and over, and calling it entertainment. Now, at 71, dealing with a diagnosis he has not made public in detail, he has finally said out loud what he could never say on television. And what he says changes the entire story. For over a decade, Silent Rivers was appointment viewing for anyone who loved the idea that the world still had unexplored corners. Daniel Voss, weathered and soft-spoken, would travel to some remote stretch of river where locals whispered about disappearances, about something enormous moving beneath the surface, about a creature nobody could explain. He would investigate. He would interview the people who lived along that water. He would piece together a theory. And then, more often than seemed possible, he would catch the thing. He would hold it up, explain what it was, marvel at it, and let it go. Millions of people watched him do this, week after week, for 11 years. And then, in the middle of what the network called its most successful season yet, the show ended. The official story was simple and tidy. Voss had done everything he set out to do. He traveled to every river worth investigating. He caught nearly every species he'd set out to find. It was time to retire on top. That was the story for 7 years. It was not the truth. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand who Daniel Voss actually is, because the man on camera was only ever a fraction of him. He didn't grow up wanting to be on television. He grew up in a small fishing town, the son of a riverboat mechanic, and by the time he was a teenager he'd already developed an obsession that most people around him found strange. He wanted to know what was actually living in the water nobody looked at twice. Not the ocean, with its sharks and whales and glamorous predators, but the brown, slow, unglamorous rivers that ran behind gas stations and through forgotten towns. While he was studying biology at university, a professor told him, not unkindly, that freshwater systems simply didn't produce the kind of danger or mystery that made for a good story. Voss didn't believe him. He spent the next 2 decades proving him wrong, mostly on his own money, mostly alone. He traveled to river systems most people couldn't find on a map. He lived out of tents and borrowed boats. He caught malaria more than once. He broke a rib in a fall on a riverbank in a country whose name most of his eventual audience wouldn't recognize. And he said it himself because the nearest doctor was 2 days away. He was robbed at a checkpoint. He nearly drowned more than once in currents he'd underestimated. None of this was filmed. None of it was known. He did it because he wanted to know the answer to a question nobody else seemed to care about. What is actually down there, and why don't we know? By the time a production company found him, he was already in his 50s, already a quiet expert in a field that barely existed as a field. The show didn't invent an adventurer. It simply pointed a camera at a man who had been doing this work in total obscurity for 25 years. And that difference is what made Silent Rivers feel real in a way its imitators never quite managed. The show format was simple but effective. Each episode opened with a mystery. A fisherman gone missing, a story passed down for generations about something enormous in a bend of river, a species everyone assumed was long extinct that a local swore he'd seen. Voss would arrive, listen more than he talked, and slowly build a case for what might actually be responsible. Then he would go after it, using nothing but decades of accumulated knowledge and a fishing rod. The show made freshwater life feel dangerous and mysterious in a way that television rarely had before, and it worked. By its 4th season, it was drawing millions of viewers an episode and airing in dozens of countries. Young people wrote to Voss saying he'd inspired them to study biology. Rivers that nobody had thought about in years suddenly had attention paid to them. For a while, it seemed like the show was doing exactly what good television is supposed to do, making people care about something they'd never considered before. But something was happening underneath all of that success, something the cameras weren't built to capture. Voss had an advantage that almost nobody else working in television had. He had been visiting many of these same rivers for 25 years before the show ever started, which meant he had a baseline. He knew what a healthy river system looked like in 1995, and he was now watching, in real time, season after season, what those same systems looked like a decade or two later. And what he was seeing was collapse. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but consistently, unmistakably, everywhere he went. A river he remembered as clear and full of fish in his 20s would be the color of rust by the time the show arrived to film it. The bank stripped bare. The fish he was searching for reduced to a handful of stressed, undersized survivors instead of the thriving population he remembered. In more than one country, mining operations upstream had poisoned water he'd once swum in without a second thought. In others, damming projects had cut off migration routes that fish had used for longer than human civilization had existed in that valley. Overfishing, agricultural runoff, shifting rainfall patterns from a changing climate. The causes varied, but the pattern didn't. Every place he returned to was worse than the last time he'd seen it, and he had seen more places, over more time, than almost anyone else alive. At first, this crept into the show only in small ways. In a Season 5 episode, filming in a river system in South Asia, Voss commented almost offhandedly that the fish he was searching for seemed to be turning up in places they'd never been recorded before, and he wondered aloud whether they were adapting to survive or simply running out of anywhere else to go. In Season 6, filming a story about a rapidly declining native species in a mountain river system, he looked less like throwaway lines and more like a man beginning to crack under the weight of something he wasn't allowed to talk about directly. By the 9th season, Voss says, he had reached a point where he could no longer separate the show he was making from the thing he felt increasingly responsible for hiding. Each episode ended the same way it always had. An impressive fish, caught and released, framed as a small victory for both curiosity and conservation. What never made it into any episode were the conversations he had off camera with local fishermen who told him their catches had dropped by staggering amounts over the previous decade. What never made it into any episode was the fact that scientists he consulted in nearly every country he visited told him, plainly, that many of the species he was filming would likely be functionally gone within 20 to 30 years. The show had time for a mystery, a hunt, and a release. It did not have time, or interest, for the slow-motion collapse happening in the water around every single one of those hunts. There was also a problem Voss hadn't anticipated when the show first became popular. Attention itself could be dangerous. When silent rivers featured a species, interest in that species would spike almost overnight. Collectors wanted specimens. Sport fishermen wanted to travel to the exact locations Voss had filmed and catch what he'd caught. Local economies, unprepared for sudden interest from outsiders, sometimes saw a rush of visitors that put new pressure on already struggling ecosystems. After an episode centered on a large, slow-growing species in a South American river system, Voss began hearing reports of increased poaching in that exact stretch of water. After a segment on a critically endangered giant catfish species in Southeast Asia, conservation groups reached out to him directly, worried that the show's popularity was accelerating the exact decline it claimed to be raising awareness about. The show he'd built to make people care about these creatures was, in some cases, painting a target on them. The moment that Voss has described as the true turning point, the one he says he avoided discussing publicly for years, happened during the filming of what would become the show's final season, in a remote river system in Central Asia. He was searching for a massive, ancient species of freshwater fish that he remembered clearly from an expedition decades earlier, back when he was young and the river had been, in his words, one of the most alive places he'd ever fished. He expected a difficult, but ultimately successful shoot, the way most of his expeditions had gone by that point in his career. What he found instead was silence. The river looked the same on the surface. The mountains around it hadn't changed, but the fish were simply gone. Not scarce, gone. Local guides took him to spots that had reliably produced sightings for generations, and there was nothing. They hiked for days to reach remote tributaries that required no roads, no easy access, no reason for anyone to have disturbed them, and there was nothing there either. They spoke with elderly fishermen who had worked that water their entire lives, and none of them had seen the species in over a year. After 3 weeks of searching, the crew finally found a single specimen, Undersized, sluggish, clearly in poor condition. Voss examined it carefully, took what measurements he could for the researchers who would eventually receive his notes, and released it back into the water. That fish became the centerpiece of the episode. Viewers saw a rare and thrilling catch. Voss knew, standing there in that river, that what he had actually just filmed was closer to a record of an ending than a discovery. On the flight home from that shoot, Voss says he made a decision he'd been circling for years without quite admitting to himself. He told the production team he wanted to make an entire episode, or several episodes, that dealt honestly and directly with what he'd been witnessing for 2.5 decades of traveling to these rivers. Not a passing comment at the end of a segment, not a wistful line delivered to camera. An honest reckoning with what was actually happening to the ecosystems the show had built its entire identity around. According to Voss, the response from the network was polite but firm. They understood that environmental issues mattered. They weren't opposed to conservation messaging appearing in the show. But Silent Rivers was built and sold as adventure entertainment, not an environmental documentary, and audiences tuned in for the thrill of a hunt, not for a sustained conversation about ecological collapse. If Voss wanted to make a different kind of show entirely, they told him, that could be discussed as a separate project down the line. But the flagship show needed to remain what it had always been. Voss understood the business logic behind that decision. He also says it was the moment he realized he could not keep doing what he had been doing. By his own account, he had started to feel, in his words, like he was lying to his audience in every single episode. He would stand in a river holding a fish that might genuinely be one of the last of its kind in that particular stretch of water, describing its biology and its remarkable adaptations with real enthusiasm, while knowing that the water around him was contaminated, that the population was in freefall, that within a decade that exact location might no longer be able to support the species at all. And the show would package all of that as an adventure story with a happy ending. Mystery solved, fish caught, fish released, cut to credits. The more he sat with that, the more it felt, in his words, like complicity in a fantasy where these places would always be there, where these creatures would always exist, where nothing was really at stake beyond the thrill of the chase. Voss proposed a final season built around returning to locations the show had visited years earlier and showing, honestly and without softening it, what had changed. He wanted to use the platform the show had built, at the exact moment it had the largest audience of its run, to tell the truth about what he had personally witnessed happening to freshwater ecosystems across the world. The network's concern, as he describes it, was that this kind of season would be too bleak, too heavy, too likely to alienate an audience that had come to expect adventure and resolution rather than an extended meditation on loss. There were meetings. There were compromises floated, perhaps a single episode with a conservation focus, perhaps a documentary special released separately from the main series. But Voss says he had reached a point where a single episode or a side project wasn't enough to answer what he felt he owed his audience after over a decade of incomplete storytelling. Late in the show's run, he told the network that the current season would be his last, not because he had run out of mysteries, not because he was tired of traveling, because he no longer felt he could ethically continue presenting a version of the world's rivers that he believed was fundamentally misleading people about how much time was left. The network did not describe it that way publicly. The official announcement talked about a natural conclusion, about Voss having accomplished what he set out to do, about ending the show on its own terms at the height of its success, bound by contractual obligations and a genuine sense of professional loyalty to the people he'd worked with for over a decade. Voss went along with that framing in interviews at the time. He talked about feeling like he'd done what he came to do. It wasn't true. There were rivers he hadn't explored. There were species he still wanted to study. What he had actually run out of, in his own later words, was the ability to keep pretending that everything was fine. After Silent Rivers ended, Voss didn't disappear from television, but the shows he made afterward were noticeably different. He hosted a smaller, less commercially successful series that examined major river systems explicitly through the lens of the environmental pressures they were facing. Deforestation along one system, industrial pollution along another, unsustainable water use along a third. Critics generally agreed the work was thoughtful and well made. It never came close to matching the audience Silent Rivers had drawn at its peak, and Voss has said, with more resignation than bitterness, that this taught him something uncomfortable about what people actually want from entertainment. Most viewers, he's come to believe, don't want environmental collapse mixed in with their adventure television. They want the adventure, the mystery, the impressive catch, and the reassuring sense that the natural world is fundamentally fine and simply waiting to be explored. Silent Rivers had given people that fantasy for over a decade, and when it ended, many of them mourned the loss of the fantasy itself, without ever quite grasping that the fantasy had been the underlying problem. In interviews given more recently, as his health has become a more pressing part of his daily reality, Voss has grown increasingly direct about how he feels about those 11 seasons. He is genuinely proud of the show and what it accomplished, the attention it brought to overlooked ecosystems, the careers in biology and conservation it's credited with inspiring, the funding and protective status some featured species eventually received as a direct result of public interest the show generated. Those are not small things, and he doesn't dismiss them, but he has also said, more than once, that he carries a real sense of having wasted an opportunity. He had, for over a decade, the attention of millions of people every single week. He has said, in one recent conversation, that they could have used that attention to help people truly understand what the world was losing, and instead, season after season, they entertained them, and he was part of that choice the entire time. There is something almost universal in what Voss is describing, beyond his own show and his own career. It points to a broader pattern in how nature television handles environmental reality. Documentaries showcase pristine-looking wilderness, without dwelling on how much smaller that wilderness becomes every single year. Wildlife programs feature endangered species, without fully conveying how close many of them actually are to disappearing entirely. Travel and adventure shows present remote, wild places as though they will simply always be there for the next generation to discover, when the honest answer, in many cases, is that they won't be. Television, by its nature, tends to protect its audience from the full weight of an ongoing collapse, because sustained dread doesn't make for good ratings. Voss believes now that his own show was part of maintaining that comfortable distance for far longer than he should have allowed it to. He has started, in his most recent public appearances, describing his life's work differently than he used to. He no longer calls himself primarily an angler, or a television host, or even a conservationist in the formal sense. He describes himself, instead, as a witness, someone who happened to spend the right decades in the right places to see, firsthand, what is being lost, and who spent much of his career documenting that loss only partially, filtered through the demands of an entertainment format that wasn't built to hold the whole truth. He says he is trying, in whatever time he has left, to tell that fuller version plainly, even though he knows it comes years later than it should have. The real story of why Silent Rivers ended was never really about a television show reaching a natural conclusion. It was about the distance between what was actually happening to the world's freshwater ecosystems and what an entertainment format built around excitement and resolution was willing, or able to show. For 11 seasons, Daniel Voss offered audiences a version of the natural world that was thrilling, mysterious, and ultimately reassuring. A world where danger existed but could always be understood, caught, and released. Where rivers were wild but fundamentally intact. Where the situation, whatever it looked like on screen, was manageable. That version was never the complete truth, and Voss has come to believe that an incomplete truth, delivered convincingly enough, can do more damage than an admitted uncertainty, because it lets an audience believe there's more time than there actually is. When Voss says now that he ran out of monsters, what he really means, by his own account, is that he ran out of a way to keep telling that incomplete version honestly. He ran out of patience with a system that consistently chose comfort over candor. Ending the show, he says, wasn't a business decision or a creative one. It was, in the end, an ethical one, walking away from the most successful project of his,